Corvvis died over a lens cap. 30 years old, owner of a seven-figure photography studio, his portfolio featured supermodels and royal families alike, and his ego was as sharp as his custom Leica. He'd been screaming at his assistant for scuffing the lens cap of his limited edition camera. "Do you know how much this costs?" "More than your rent for a year, you incompetent buffoon." We'd spun too fast, tripped over a trailing power cord, and cracked his skull against the marble floor of his Chelsea studio. The last thought before blackness? The paparazzi will get photos of my corpse with bedhead. I'll never live this down. Then pain. Not the dull thud of a skull fracture, but a searing, skin-stripping agony that made him want to scream, except his throat only let out a high, wheezing yelp. Cale's eyes snapped open. No hospital. No silk sheets. No concerned assistants shoving champagne and painkillers at him. Just mud. Freezing, viscous, ash-streaked mud that clung to his fur. Panic exploded in his chest as he tried to push himself up, only to find his limbs were wrong. Too short, too thin, covered in matted, patchy gray fur that felt like coarse wool against his skin. A torn ear flicked involuntarily, sending a jolt of pain down his spine, and when he lifted a paw, to his face, he felt the sharp edge of a broken claw. "What the fuck?" He tried to snarl, but it came out as a raspy, high-pitched growl. A few feet away, a rain puddle glinted under a storm-darkened sky. Cale dragged himself toward it, his broken leg throbbing with every movement, and when he finally saw his reflection, he nearly passed out. It was a fox. A mangy, starved, utterly grotesque fox. Fur clotted with dirt and blood, one ear half torn off, ribs protruding so sharply they looked like they'd pierced the skin. This wasn't some majestic celestial beast from fantasy novels. This was a street rat with a bushy tail. A far cry from the man who'd spent 2 hours every morning perfecting his skincare routine and styling his silver blonde hair. "Karma's a bitch," he wheezed, collapsing back into the mud. He'd spent his entire life judging people by their looks, dismissing anyone who didn't meet his impossible standards of beauty. Now he was trapped in a body that would have made him cross the street to avoid it. The sound of boots, heavy, rhythmic, thudding against cobblestones, jolted him awake. The air grew thick, almost tangible, with a pressure that made his fur stand on end. Cale lifted his head, squinting through the rain, and froze. The battlefield was a massacre. Cultivators in silver and blue robes lay crumpled on the ground, their spiritual weapons shattered into shards. Blood soaked the cobblestones, mixing with the rain to form dark rivulets. And walking through the carnage was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, draped in a cloak of black silk that billowed around him like smoke, embroidered with silver runes that glowed faintly in the darkness. His skin was pale, paler than the marble floors of Cale's studio, and his fingers, long and elegant, were stained with a faint sheen of dark energy. But the most striking thing about him was the thick black blindfold tied tightly across his eyes, covering what Cale could only assume were eyes as terrifying as the rest of him. Demon Lord. The thought hit Cale like a truck. A literal, walking, world-ending Demon Lord. And Cale was lying directly in his path. Survival instinct screamed at him to run, but his broken leg wouldn't move, and even if it could, he doubted he'd get 3 steps before the man vaporized him. So he did the only thing he could. He bared his teeth, let out the fiercest snarl his tiny body could manage, and prepared to go down fighting. Or at least go down looking slightly less pathetic. The Demon Lord stopped. He tilted his head, the blindfold facing Cale directly, as if he could see through the fabric. The air grew heavier, the pressure so intense Cale could barely breathe. He could feel the man's power raw, unbridled, to make the earth tremble, and it made every hair on his body stand on end. "Interesting," the man said. His voice was deep, a rich baritone that rolled like thunder, smooth as velvet but sharp as a blade. It sent a shiver down Cale's spine, not just fear, but something else. Something warm and unfamiliar that he quickly dismissed as shock. He took a step closer, Then another. His boots stopped mere inches from Cale's nose, and Cale could smell him, cedar, smoke, and something faintly metallic like polished steel. He snarled again, lunging forward to bite the hem of the man's cloak, but the demon lord didn't even flinch. Slowly he crouched down. His pale hand reached toward Cale, and Cale squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the killing blow. But instead of pain, he felt a gentle brush of fingers against his matted fur. Warmth flooded his body. Not the sticky heat of the summer sun, but a pure soothing warmth that seeped into his bones, easing the pain in his broken leg and chasing away the chill of the rain. It was spiritual energy. Cale recognized the term from the fantasy novels his assistant used to read. It was unlike anything he'd ever felt. "Fierce little thing," the demon lord murmured. His fingers traced the edge of Cale's torn ear, so gently Cale almost purred before he caught himself. Broken, abandoned, full of rage. He scooped Cale up in one arm, tucking him against his chest. Cale stiffened, his muddy fur rubbing against the pristine black silk of the man's cloak. He should have hated it, hated being touched, hated being so vulnerable, hated this man who reeked of death and power. But the warmth of the demon lord's body was too comforting, the steady beat of his heart against Cale's ear too soothing. "Where will you go?" the demon lord whispered, his breath warm against Cale's fur. He stepped over a fallen cultivator, his movements effortless despite the carnage around them. Back to the mud. To starve? To be torn apart by wild beasts? Cale didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could do was glare at the man's chin, his tiny paws curled into fists. "I have a fortress," the demon lord said. Sprawling halls. Empty rooms. Too much silence. He adjusted his grip, holding Cale closer, as if afraid he'd slip away. "Come with me. Be my companion. We can be monsters together." Companion. The word made Cale snort. This man didn't want a companion. He wanted a pet. A novelty. Something to amuse him in his empty fortress. And Cale, former king of the fashion world, was now reduced to being a blind demon lord's ugly pet fox. But then again, it was better than dying in the mud. Fine, Cale thought, glaring up at the demon lord's blindfold. But I'm not some lapdog. I want the good stuff, silk beds, gourmet food, zero touching unless I initiate it. And if you even think about treating me like a common beast, I'll bite your fingers off." The demon lord chuckled. It was a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through his chest, and Cale found himself leaning into it despite his better judgment. "Very well," he said. "No touching unless you allow it. And I'll feed you better than any king." He stood up, turning away from the battlefield, and began walking toward the horizon, where a massive, shadowy fortress loomed against the storm clouds. Cale lay against his chest, his broken leg throbbing less and less with each step, and tried to ignore the warm, fuzzy feeling spreading through his chest. This was a transaction. Nothing more. He'd survive, milk the demon lord for all the luxury he could get, and then figure out how to get back to his own body. At least, that's what he told himself. Lord Corvvis's fortress was a masterpiece of dark architecture. Sprawling towers that pierced the storm clouds, walls of black stone reinforced with spiritual energy, and halls lined with tapestries depicting battles and conquests. It was cold, imposing, and utterly lacking in the soft, luxurious touches Cale was used to. But then again, it was a demon lord's lair, not a five-star hotel. Corvvis carried him to a spacious chamber at the top of the tallest tower, its walls lined with bookshelves, and its floor covered in a thick, black rug that felt like velvet under Cale's paws. A massive bed dominated one corner, draped in silk sheets the color of midnight, and a fireplace crackled with green flames, casting warm light across the room. "Rest," Corvvis said, placing Cale gently on the bed. The silk was softer than anything Cale had ever felt, softer than the Egyptian cotton sheets in his penthouse, and he found himself sinking into it despite his resolve to hate everything. "I'll send for food." He turned to leave, but Cale let out a sharp bark. Corvvis paused, tilting his head. "Yes." Kale glared at him, then at the floor. He wasn't about to eat off the ground like a common dog. He was Kale Voss for fuck's sake. He needed a bowl. A silver bowl. On a table. Corvvis chuckled. You're particular, aren't you? He snapped his fingers, and a servant appeared in the doorway, trembling so violently Kale was surprised he didn't collapse. Bring a silver bowl. And the finest spirit meat you can find. Cooked in broth. No bones. The servant bowed deeply, scurrying away, and Corvvis turned back to Kale. Better. Kale huffed, turning his head away. It was a start. Corvvis didn't leave. He pulled a chair up to the bed, sitting down and leaning back, his fingers steepled under his chin. Kale could feel his gaze, even through the blindfold, like a physical thing, and it made him squirm. He hated being watched. Hated being the center of attention when he looked like this. Who are you? Corvvis asked suddenly. His voice was soft, curious, not the booming command Kale had expected. What are you? Kale froze. He couldn't tell him the truth. Couldn't say, I'm Kale Voss, world-famous photographer, trapped in the body of an ugly fox. Corvvis would either kill him or lock him up as a freak. So he let out a soft growl, nuzzling into the silk sheets. Play, dumb. Act like a normal fox. Corvvis smiled. It was a small, faint smile, but it transformed his face, softening his sharp features, making him look less like a demon lord and more like a man. You're not like other foxes, he said. Your aura is different. Bright, fierce, like a flame in the dark. Kale's ears twitched. He didn't know what that meant, but he didn't like the way it made his chest feel warm. The servant returned a few minutes later, carrying a silver bowl on a wooden tray. He set it on the table next to the bed, bowed deeply, and scurried out of the room as if his life depended on it. Kale's stomach growled loudly. He hadn't eaten since before he died, and the smell of the broth was intoxicating. But he didn't move. He wasn't about to beg. Corvvis noticed. He leaned forward, picking up the bowl, and held it out to Kale. Eat, he said. His voice was soft, not a command, but something else, encouragement. Kale glared at him. I can feed myself, he thought. But when he tried to stand, his broken leg gave out, and he collapsed back onto the bed with a yelp. Corvus's smile faded. Your leg, he said. He set the bowl down, reaching out to touch Kale's leg, but Kale snapped at him, baring his teeth. Don't touch me, he snarled. Corvvis pulled his hand back, his expression unreadable. I only want to heal it, he said. It's broken. You can't walk on it like this. Kale hesitated. He hated being vulnerable, hated relying on anyone else. But the pain was getting worse, and he knew he couldn't survive like this. Reluctantly, he lifted his legs slightly, letting Corvvis know it was okay. Corvus's fingers brushed against his fur, warm and gentle. The same soothing energy as before flooded his body, and Kale felt the bone mending, the pain fading away. He let out a soft sigh, leaning into the touch despite himself. Better? Corvvis asked. Kale nodded, too tired to glare. He was suddenly exhausted, from the pain, from the shock of transmigrating, from the long walk to the fortress. He curled up on the silk sheets, closing his eyes. Corvvis didn't move. He sat there, watching Kale, his presence a steady, comforting weight in the room. Kale should have felt trapped, should have felt afraid. But instead, he felt safe, safer than he'd ever felt in his own world, where everyone wanted something from him, his talent, his connections, his money. Here, Corvvis didn't want anything from him. He just wanted a companion, a monster to keep in company in his empty fortress. Kale drifted off to sleep, the sound of Corvus's steady breathing lulling him into a deep, dreamless slumber. The next morning, Kale woke up to the smell of fresh bread and honey. He stretched, his leg now fully healed, and jumped off the bed, landing gracefully on the rug. His fur was still matted and ugly, but he felt better, stronger, more alert. Corvvis was sitting by the fireplace, reading a book with his fingers tracing the pages. Cale had forgotten he was blind, forgotten that he couldn't see the words, that he was reading through touch alone. It made something twist in Cale's chest, something he didn't want to examine. "Good morning," Corvvis said, looking up. His blindfold was still in place, but Cale could have sworn he was looking directly at him. "Hungry?" Cale nodded, padding over to the table where a silver bowl of bread, honey, and spirit meat waited. He ate greedily, the food far better than anything he'd had in his previous life, and when he was done, he curled up on a rug in front of the fireplace, warming his fur. Corvvis went back to his book, but Cale couldn't stop watching him. The way his fingers moved over the pages, the way his jaw tightened when he read something intense, the way the firelight cast shadows over his pale face. He was beautiful, terrifyingly beautiful. The kind of beauty that was dangerous, sharp, intense, impossible to look away from. Cale had spent his entire life surrounded by beautiful people. Models, actors, socialites, all of them perfect, all of them carefully curated to meet his standards. But none of them had ever looked like Corvvis. None of them had ever had that raw, unbridled power, that quiet intensity, that undercurrent of loneliness that Cale could sense beneath his calm exterior. "You're staring," Corvvis said, not looking up from his book. Cale's ears twitched. He looked away, pretending to groom his fur. "I'm not," he thought. But he was, and he hated that he couldn't stop. Corvvis chuckled. "You're a strange little fox," he said, "full of pride, full of rage, full of secrets." He closed the book, setting it aside, and turned toward Cale. "Tell me, what are you hiding?" Cale froze. He couldn't tell him. He wouldn't. So he stood up, padding over to Corvvis, and nudged his hand with his nose. A peace offering, or maybe a distraction. Corvus's fingers brushed against his fur, and Cale felt that warm, fuzzy feeling spread through his chest again. He leaned into the touch, closing his eyes, and let out a soft purr. "Fine," Corvvis said, his voice soft. "I won't press. But when you're ready, I'm here." Cale didn't answer. He just purred louder, letting Corvvis scratch behind his ears, the spot that made him melt despite his best efforts. This was dangerous. He was getting attached to a blind demon lord, to a man who killed without hesitation, to a man who saw him ugly, broken, and trapped, and still chose to keep him. But then again, Cale had never been good at staying away from danger. The days passed in a blur of luxury and tension. Corvvis kept his promise. Cale had the softest silk beds, the finest food, and all the space he wanted. But he also kept a close eye on Cale, following him around the fortress, sitting with him in the library, even meditating with him in the garden. Cale tried to keep his distance, tried to remind himself that this was a transaction. But Corvvis was impossible to resist. He was kind in his own way. He remembered Cale's preferences: honey on his bread, warm milk before bed, no loud noises in the morning. He talked to him not like a pet, but like a friend, telling him stories of battles and conquests, of the sects that hated him, of the loneliness that came with being a demon lord. And Cale found himself opening up. Not about his past life, he couldn't, but about his feelings. He'd snarl when Corvvis was gone too long, nuzzle his hand when he was tired, even follow him around the fortress like a lost puppy. Every touch, every word, every look, even through the blindfold, was charged with something unspoken. Cale would find himself leaning into Corvus's hand, then pulling away, pretending to be annoyed. Corvvis would trace the edge of Cale's torn ear, then pull back as if afraid he'd crossed the line. It was a dance. A dangerous, thrilling dance. And Cale was hooked. One evening, Corvvis took him to the garden, a vast moonlit space filled with black roses and glowing mushrooms. The air was cool, the stars bright, and Cale found himself padding along beside Corvvis, his tail flicking with excitement. "You like it here?" Corvvis asked, his voice soft. Cale nodded, nuzzling his hand. He did. It was peaceful. Quiet. A far cry from the chaos of his previous life. Corvvis sat down on a stone bench, pulling Cale onto his lap. Cale stiffened. He wasn't used to being this close. But then Corvus's arms wrapped around him, holding him gently, and he melted. "I've never had a companion before," Corvvis said, his breath warm against Cale's fur. "Never wanted one. But you're different." Cale's heart raced. He looked up at Corvvis, his tiny paws resting on his chest, and stared at his blindfold. He wondered what was underneath. Wondered if Corvus's eyes were as beautiful as the rest of him. Wondered if he'd ever get to see them. "Everyone fears me," Corvvis said, his voice quiet. "They see my power. My blindness. They think I'm a monster. And maybe I am. But you don't fear me. You snarl at me. You demand things. You treat me like a person." Cale's throat tightened. He wanted to tell him. Wanted to say, "I'm not a fox. I'm a man." A man who spent his entire life being feared and admired for his looks, not his soul. A man who's just as broken as you are. But he couldn't. So he nuzzled Corvus's chin, letting out a soft whine. Corvvis chuckled, scratching behind Cale's ears. "I think I'm growing fond of you, little fox," he said. His voice was low, husky, and Cale felt a shiver run down his spine. Very fond. The words hung in there, heavy, charged. Cale's heart raced, and he found himself leaning up, pressing his nose against Corvus's lips. It was a bold move, a stupid move, but he couldn't help himself. He wanted to kiss him, wanted to feel his lips against his, wanted to know if the rest of him was as warm as his hands. Corvvis froze. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he leaned down, his lips brushing against Cale's nose. It was a soft, gentle touch, so gentle Cale almost missed it, but it sent a fire through his body. "Careful," Corvvis whispered. His breath was warm against Cale's fur. "I might get addicted." Cale pulled back, his face burning. If a fox could blush. He'd crossed a line, a big line, and now he didn't know what to do. But Corvvis just smiled, holding him closer. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I won't hurt you. Never." Cale closed his eyes, leaning into Corvus's chest. He was in deep, way too deep. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care. The peace didn't last. A week later, Corvvis hosted a meeting with the elders of the neighboring sects, something he did once a month to maintain diplomatic relations, though Cale suspected it was really just to remind them who was in charge. Cale sat on Corvus's lap during the meeting, pretending to sleep, but his ears were pricked, listening to every word. The elders were obsequious, their voices dripping with false respect. They praised Corvus's power, his wisdom, his benevolence, but Cale could hear the fear in their voices, the hatred. And then there was the tea. A servant entered the room, carrying a silver tray with a porcelain teacup. He bowed deeply, his hands trembling, and set the cup down next to Corvus's hand. Cale's nose twitched. Under the scent of jasmine, he smelled something else, something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit and almonds. Poison. Cale's eyes snapped open. He looked up at Corvvis, who was reaching for the cup, his fingers inches from the porcelain. No, Cale thought. He couldn't let him drink it. He wouldn't. Before he could think, he lunged forward, sinking his teeth into Corvus's wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, but enough to stop him. Corvvis froze. "What?" The servant let out a gasp, stumbling backward. "The beast. It's attacking the Lord." Cale let go of Corvus's wrist, growling at the servant. He was lying. He'd poisoned the tea, and now he was trying to blame Cale. Corvus's head snapped toward the servant. Even through the blindfold, Cale could feel his anger, raw, unbridled, terrifying. "Silence," he said. His voice was cold, colder than the snow outside. "What did you put in the tea?" The servant paled. "In nothing, my lord. I swear." "The fox." "Lie," Cale snarled. He lunged forward, sinking his teeth into the servant's ankle. The man screamed, falling to the ground. Corvus's hand shot out. The servant was lifted into the air, his throat constricting as an invisible force crushed it. "You dare poison me?" Corvus whispered. His voice was so quiet it was almost inaudible, but it sent a chill down Cale's spine. "You dare bring harm to my home? To what is mine?" The servant's face turned purple. He struggled, gasping for air, but it was no use. Corvus's power was too strong. Cale watched, a mixture of horror and fascination washing over him. He'd known Corvus was dangerous, known he was a killer. But seeing him like this, cold, ruthless, unforgiving, it was a stark reminder of who he was. Demon Lord. A monster. And yet Cale didn't feel afraid. He felt protected. Corvus closed his fist. The servant fell to the ground, lifeless. The elders fell to their knees, trembling, swearing they had no knowledge of the poisoning. Corvus ignored them. He turned to Cale, his anger fading, replaced by concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his fingers brushing against Cale's fur. "Did he touch you?" Cale shook his head, nuzzling his hand. He was fine. But Corvus, he'd almost died. Corvus pulled him closer, holding him tightly. "You saved me," he whispered. His voice was raw, emotional. "You could have let me drink it. But you didn't." Cale closed his eyes. He'd done it without thinking, without hesitation, because he cared about him, because he couldn't bear the thought of losing him. The elders were still on their knees, begging for mercy. Corvus waved a hand, dismissing them. "Get out," he said, "and tell your sections. If anyone dares to harm me or mine again, I will burn your temples to the ground. I will slaughter your disciples. I will make you regret ever breathing." The elders scrambled to their feet, bowing deeply, and fled the room. Corvus turned back to Cale, his fingers tracing the edge of his torn ear. "You're my guardian angel," he said, his voice soft. "My little protector." Cale huffed. He wasn't an angel. He was a fox. A former fashion photographer trapped in a fox's body. But for Corvus, he'd be anything. "I think I'm in love with you," Corvus whispered. The words hit Cale like a bolt of lightning. He froze, his heart racing. He'd been waiting for them, hoping for them. But now that they were here, he didn't know what to say. He couldn't say it back, not in words. So he leaned up, pressing his nose against Corvus's lips again. This time, Corvus didn't hesitate. He leaned down, his lips brushing against Cale's, and Cale felt a fire ignite in his chest. It was a soft, gentle kiss, nothing more than a brush of lips against fur, but it was enough. It was everything. When they pulled apart, Corvus rested his forehead against Cale's. "I don't care what you are," he said. "I don't care if you're a fox, a demon, or something else entirely. I love you." Cale closed his eyes, letting out a soft purr. He loved him too, more than he'd ever loved anyone. But their happiness was short-lived. That night, as they lay in bed, Cale curled up on Corvus's chest. A sudden chill filled the room. Cale's ears pricked. He heard it, the sound of footsteps. Quiet, stealthy, too quiet for human ears. Assassins. Cale let out a sharp bark, digging his claws into Corvus's chest. Corvus jolted awake. "What is it?" Before he could answer, the windows shattered. For figures dressed in black leaped into the room, their faces hidden by masks, their hands wielding poisoned swords. Corvus reacted instantly. He grabbed Cale, tossing him behind the bed, and summoned his spiritual sword, a blade of dark energy that glowed like a black sun. "Stay there," he snarled. Cale cowered behind a bed, his heart racing. He wanted to help, wanted to fight, but he was a fox. a small, ugly fox. What could he do? The assassins attacked, their swords clashing with Corvus's. The room filled with the sound of metal on metal, of spiritual energy colliding. Corvus fought with grace and power, his movements fluid despite his blindness, but the assassins were skilled. They moved in perfect synchronization, attacking from all angles. Cale watched terrified. He could see the sweat on Corvus's brow, the way his breath came in ragged gasps. He was tiring. And then one of the assassins made a move. He darted to the side, distracting Corvus, while another snuck up behind him, his sword raised. No. Cale screamed. He didn't think. He just acted. He launched himself from behind the bed, his tiny body flying through the air, and landed on the assassin's back. He sank his teeth into the man's neck as hard as he could. The assassin screamed, dropping his sword. He reached back, grabbing Cale by the scruff of the neck, and slammed him against the wall. Pain exploded in Cale's body. He felt his ribs crack, his breath leaving him in a rush. He fell to the ground, gasping for air, and watched as the assassin reached for his sword again. Corvus's roar echoed through the room. It was a sound of pure rage, animalistic, terrifying. He turned, his sword slicing through the air, and decapitated the assassin with one blow. The other 3 assassins froze, terror in their eyes. Corvus didn't give them a chance to react. He moved like a blur, his sword cutting through them one by one. In seconds, they were all dead. The room fell silent. Corvus dropped his sword, stumbling toward Cale. He fell to his knees, his hands shaking as he lifted Cale into his arms. Cale, he whispered. His voice was broken, tears streaming down his face. Cale, look at me. Please. Cale's vision was blurry. He could feel Corvus's hands on him, warm and gentle, but the pain was too much. He tried to nuzzle his hand, but he couldn't move. I'm sorry, he thought. I'm so sorry. He closed his eyes, and the world went dark. Darkness. Not the peaceful black of sleep, but a suffocating void, cold, empty, endless. Cale floated in it, his consciousness frayed like a threadbare blanket. He could feel nothing. No pain, no warmth, no beat of his own heart. For a moment, he thought he died again. Thought this was the end. No paparazzi, no lens caps, no ugly fox body. Just nothingness. Then he heard it. A voice, deep, ragged, broken, calling his name over and over like a prayer. Cale. Cale, please, don't leave me. Corvus. The sound cut through the void like a blade. Cale's consciousness jolted, sharpening. He tried to move, to respond, but his body felt like lead. He couldn't open his eyes, couldn't lift his head, couldn't even let out a whimper. He was trapped, stuck between life and death, with Corvus's voice as his only anchor. Please, Corvus whispered. Cale could hear the tears in his voice, the raw, unfiltered panic. I can't lose you. Not you. I'll give anything, my power, my life, my soul. Just bring him back. Please. A warmth spread through Cale's chest. Not the spiritual energy he'd felt before. This was different. Thicker. Richer. Like liquid gold, seeping into his veins, knitting his shattered bones back together, breathing life into his stilled heart. It was Corvus's energy, his life force. He was giving Cale pieces of himself, piece by piece, to pull him back from the edge. Cale wanted to scream, to tell him to stop, to say he wasn't worth it, that he was just a vain, selfish man trapped in a fox's body. But he couldn't. All he could do was let the warmth wrap around him, let Corvus's voice guide him back to the world of the living. Slowly, the void faded. The cold receded. Cale's senses returned, one by one. The smell of medicinal herbs, thick and earthy, the feel of soft silk beneath his fur, the sound of Corvus's ragged breathing close by. And the pain. Oh, the pain. It was a dull, throbbing ache that pulsed through every bone, every muscle, every nerve. But it was bearable. It was proof he was alive. Cale's eyes fluttered open. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of glowing crystals mounted on the walls. He was lying on Corvus's massive bed, draped in a blanket of black silk, his body wrapped in bandages that smelled of healing salves. Corvus was sitting on the floor beside the bed, his back pressed against the mattress, his head resting on the edge. He looked terrible, pale, gaunt, his eyes sunken, his black hair tangled and matted with sweat. His blindfold was gone. Cale's breath caught in his throat. He'd wondered what lay beneath the blindfold. Wondered if Corvus's eyes were as beautiful as the rest of him. But nothing could have prepared him for the reality. Corvus's eyes were gone. Not just blind, destroyed. A jagged, ugly scar sliced horizontally across the bridge of his nose, cutting through both eye sockets, the skin around it discolored and puckered. Dark, vein-like patterns spiderwebbed out from the scar, a sickly purple-black that Cale recognized from old nature documentaries. Poison. Slow, cruel, irreversible poison. Someone had done this to him. Someone had stolen his sight, left him to navigate the world in darkness, to trust no one but his own spiritual sense. No wonder he was lonely. No wonder he'd latched onto a mangy fox that didn't fear him. Cale's chest ached, not from the pain of his injuries, but from a raw, overwhelming sadness. He'd spent weeks complaining about his ugly fur, his torn ear, his tiny body, while the man who loved him had lost so much more. Corvus's head snapped up. He couldn't see Cale, but he could sense him, could feel the shift in his aura, the flutter of his eyelids. A look of pure, unadulterated relief washed over his face, followed by a wave of exhaustion, so intense he swayed slightly. "You're awake," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Thank the heavens. You're awake." He reached out, his hand trembling as it brushed against Cale's fur. Cale leaned into the touch, letting out a soft, weak purr. He wanted to comfort Corvus, to tell him it was okay, to kiss the scar on his face and promise him he'd never be alone again. But he was still a fox. All he could do was nuzzle his hand, his tiny paws resting on Corvus's wrist. Corvus's fingers tightened around him, gentle but possessive. He lifted Cale carefully, holding him close to his chest, his head resting on top of Cale's matted fur. Cale could feel his tears soaking into his fur, hot and salty. "I thought I'd lost you," Corvus said, his voice breaking. "When you fell, when your heart stopped, I didn't know what to do. I tore open my core, fed you my heart blood, forced my cultivation into your meridians. I didn't care if it killed me. I just couldn't let you die. Heart blood." Cale's ears flattened against his head. He'd read about it in those fantasy novels his assistant loved. Cultivators' heart blood was the essence of their soul, their life force condensed into liquid form. To give it away was to permanently damage one's cultivation, to shorten one's lifespan, to weaken oneself irreparably. Corvus had sacrificed a piece of his soul to save him. A man who'd been betrayed, poisoned, left blind and alone, had given up part of himself for a fox he'd known for a few weeks. Cale's eyes burned. He'd never been loved like this. Never had anyone care about him so much they'd risk their own life to save his. In his previous life, people had loved his looks, his talent, his money, but never him. Never the arrogant, vain, selfish man beneath the perfect exterior. But Corvus did. Corvus loved him, ugly, broken, fox and all. Cale nuzzled Corvus's neck, letting out a soft whine. "I love you too," he wanted to say. "I'm sorry I'm not human. I'm sorry I can't hold you back. I'm sorry I'm so useless." Corvus chuckled, a wet, exhausted sound. He brushed his fingers through Cale's fur, careful to avoid the bandages. "You're such a strange little thing," he said. "Fierce, stubborn, but so gentle when you want to be." He pressed a kiss to the top of Cale's head, his lips warm against the matted fur. "I don't care what you are, Cale. Fox, demon, human, None of it matters. You're mine, and I'm yours. Forever, forever. The word hung in the air, heavy and sweet. Cale closed his eyes, leaning into Corvus's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. It was a promise, a vow, and for the first time in his life, Cale believed it. The next few weeks were a blur of healing and quiet intimacy. Corvus rarely left Cale's side. He fed him by hand, soft pieces of spirit meat, sweet honey bread, warm milk laced with healing herbs, bathed him gently in a tub of steaming herbal water, and read to him from ancient tomes, his fingers tracing the pages as he spoke. Cale's body healed quickly, thanks to Corvus's heart blood and the constant flow of spiritual energy he poured into him. His broken ribs mended, his torn ears scabbed over, and his matted fur began to grow back, softer, shinier, a deep silver gray that glinted in the light. He still wasn't a majestic celestial fox, but he was no longer the mangy street rat he'd been when they first met. But it wasn't just his body that changed. Something shifted inside him, something deep, primal, tied to the fox's bloodline. He began to have dreams, vivid, ancient visions of forests and mountains, of foxes with glowing fur and powerful auras, of a flower that bloomed only at the peak of a sacred mountain, its petals glowing like sunlight through mist. The veiled sun lotus. The name came to him in a dream, whispered by voices that felt like distant ancestors. A mythical flower said to cure any poison, heal any wound, restore what had been lost. It was the only thing in the 9 provinces that could cleanse the poison from Corvus's eyes, that could give him back his sight. Cale's heart raced when he woke from that dream. A cure. He could give Corvus his eyes back, could let him see the world again, could let him see him not as a fox, but as the man he truly was. But the dream came with a price. A cold, cruel catch that made Cale's blood run cold. The veiled sun lotus grew only at the peak of Mount Ember, a sacred mountain surrounded by a divine barrier. No beast could pass through the barrier, not even a spirit fox. The lotus could only be harvested by a human soul. Cale was trapped in a fox's body. A beast. He couldn't pass the barrier. Couldn't harvest the lotus. Unless he forced a transformation. Forced his human soul to take over, to burn away the fox form ahead of its natural time. To do that, he'd have to summon a heavenly tribulation, a storm of divine lightning that would purge his beastly essence and reveal his human form. The survival rate was less than 1 in 10,000. Cale lay on Corvus's chest that night, listening to his steady breathing, and thought about the risk. The heavenly tribulation would be agony, lightning hot enough to scorch his bones, to tear his soul apart. He might not survive, might die in the storm, leaving Corvus alone again, his eyes still poisoned, his heart broken. But what if he did survive? What if he could harvest the lotus, cure Corvus, and stand before him as a man? What if he could kiss him properly, hold him, tell him he loved him with words instead of whimpers and purrs? It was a risk. A stupid, reckless, suicidal risk. But it was Corvus. Corvus, who'd given him his life. Corvus, who loved him unconditionally. Corvus, who deserved to see the world again. Cale nuzzled Corvus's neck, his tiny paws curling into the fabric of his robe. I'll do it, he thought. For you. I'll climb that mountain. I'll face the tribulation. I'll give you back your sight, even if it kills me. Corvus stirred, his hand brushing against Cale's fur. Bad dream, he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. Cale shook his head, nuzzling his hand. No, just making a promise. Corvus smiled, pulling him closer. Rest, he said, his voice soft. I'm here. Always. Cale closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He lay there, memorizing the feel of Corvus's chest beneath him, the sound of his breath, the smell of cedar and smoke that was uniquely his. He memorized every detail, every touch, every word, just in case. Just in case that heavenly tribulation was the end. The days passed, and Kale prepared. He began to meditate, focusing on his human soul, on the memories of his previous life, his studio, his camera, his silver blonde hair, his sharp cheekbones. He practiced channeling the spiritual energy Corvvis had given him, using it to strengthen his soul, to prepare it for the transformation. Corvvis noticed the change in him. Noticed how he'd grown quieter, more focused, how he'd started to spend hours alone in the garden, staring up at the mountains in the distance. He asked about it, but Kale just nuzzled his hand, unable to explain. He couldn't tell Corvvis what he planned to do. Couldn't bear to see the fear in his eyes, the way he'd beg him not to go. So he kept his secret. Let Corvvis dote on him. Let him hold him. Let him kiss his fur. Let himself be loved, just for a little while, before he had to risk everything. The Lacha between them grew more intense as the days went on. Every touch felt charged, every word heavy with unspoken emotion. Corvvis would trace the line of Kale's spine with his fingers, slow and deliberate, and Kale would shiver, leaning into the touch, his heart racing. Corvvis would whisper his name in the dark, his voice low and husky, and Kale would whimper, pressing his nose against his neck, wishing he could speak, wishing he could tell him everything. One night, they were in the garden, sitting on the stone bench where they'd shared their first kiss. The moon was full, casting silver light over the black roses and glowing mushrooms. Corvvis had his arm around Kale, holding him close, his chin resting on top of his head. "I wish I could see you," Corvvis whispered, his fingers brushing against Kale's ear. "Not with my spiritual sense. With my eyes. I want to see the color of your fur, the shape of your face, the fire in your eyes. I want to memorize every detail of you." Kale's throat tightened. He nuzzled Corvus's hand, letting out a soft whine. "You will," he thought. "Soon. You'll see me. All of me." Corvvis smiled, pressing a kiss to his fur. "I know you're hiding something," he said. "Something big. You've been distant, restless, like you're getting ready to leave." His voice cracked. "Please don't leave me, Kale. I can't lose you. Not now." Kale's heart broke. He turned in Corvus's arms, pressing his nose against his lips, his tiny paws resting on his chest. "I'm not leaving," he thought. "I'm coming back. For you." Corvvis leaned down, kissing him gently, soft, warm, lingering. It was a kiss full of love, full of fear, full of longing. Kale closed his eyes, savoring the feeling, memorizing the taste of his lips. When they pulled apart, Corvvis rested his forehead against Kale's. "I love you," he whispered. "More than anything. More than my power, more than my life. You're the only thing that matters to me. I love you too." Kale wanted to scream. "I want to give you your sight back. I want to be human for you. I'm wanting to risk everything for you." But all he could do was purr loud and deep, pressing his head against Corvus's chest. Corvvis held him tighter, as if afraid he'd slip away. "Whatever you're planning," he said, his voice soft, "whatever you're hiding, just promise me you'll come back. Promise me you won't leave me alone." Kale nuzzled his hand, his eyes burning with tears he couldn't shed. "I promise," he thought. "I'll come back, even if it kills me." The day Kale chose to summon the heavenly tribulation was overcast, the sky dark with storm clouds. He'd waited until Corvvis was in his study, meeting with a sect elder, knowing he wouldn't be disturbed, knowing he wouldn't have to see Corvus's face when he left. He slipped out of the fortress, his paws light on the stone steps, and ran toward Mount Ember. The journey was long, the terrain rough, but he ran with a single-minded purpose, his heart set in the peak on the veiled sun lotus on Corvvis. When he reached the base of the mountain, he stopped. The divine barrier was visible, a shimmering golden dome that covered the mountain, its surface rippling like water. Kale could feel its power, warm and ancient, repelling all beasts. He couldn't pass through it as a fox, couldn't even touch it without being burned. This was it. There was no turning back. Kale took a deep breath, closing his eyes. He focused on his human soul, on the memories of his previous life, on the love he felt for Corvvis. He channeled every ounce of spiritual energy he'd absorbed from Corvvis, every bit of strength he'd gained from his healing, and sent a pulse of power into the sky. A roar of thunder echoed through the mountains. The storm clouds gathered, darkening the sky until it was as black as night. Lightning flashed, jagged and bright, illuminating the mountain. Wind howled, swirling around Cale, lifting his fur. The heavenly tribulation had arrived. Cale stood his ground, his tiny body trembling not with fear, but with determination. He opened his eyes, staring up at the sky, and let out a fierce snarl, a sound that was half fox, half human, full of rage and love and resolve. The first bolt of lightning struck. It hit him square in the chest, a searing pain that made him scream, a human scream, raw and loud, tearing from his throat. He felt his fur burning, his skin charring, his bones cracking. It was agony, worse than the fall from the yacht, worse than the assassin's blow, worse than anything he'd ever felt. But he didn't fall. He stood, his legs shaking, his body smoking, and stared up at the sky. He wouldn't give up. Not for Corvvis. The second bolt struck. This time it hit him in the head, and he felt his fox form beginning to unravel, for melting away, bones shifting, limbs lengthening. He could feel his human face emerging, his silver blonde hair growing, his sharp cheekbones forming. The pain was unbearable, but he clung to consciousness, clinging to the image of Corvus's face, to the sound of his voice, to the promise he'd made. The third bolt struck. It was the strongest yet, hotter, brighter, more destructive. It tore through his body, purging the last of the fox essence, leaving only his human soul, his human form. Cale fell to his knees, gasping for air, his body smoking, his skin covered in burns. But he was human. He was free. He looked down at his hands, pale, slender, familiar. At his arms, his legs, his torso. He was Cale Voss again, 30 years old, sharp, arrogant, but changed. Softened by love, strengthened by sacrifice. The storm faded. The clouds parted, letting sunlight stream down onto the mountain. The divine barrier rippled, then opened, welcoming the human soul that stood before it. Cale stood, his legs unsteady, and began to climb. The path to the peak was steep, rocky, but he climbed with renewed purpose. His body ached, his burns throbbed, but he didn't stop. He thought of Corvvis, blind, lonely, waiting for him. Thought of the kiss they'd shared in the garden, of the way he'd held him when he was injured, of the tears he'd shed when he thought he'd lost him. He climbed until his legs gave out, until his lungs burned, until he reached the peak. And there it was, the veiled sun lotus. It grew in the center of a small clearing, its petals glowing like sunlight, its scent sweet and healing. It was more beautiful than Cale had imagined, more beautiful than any model he'd ever photographed, more beautiful than any sunset he'd ever captured. Cale fell to his knees beside it, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch it. The petals were warm, soft, radiating healing energy. He plucked it carefully, holding it in his palm, and felt its power surge through him, healing his burns, mending his aches, restoring his strength. He did it. He survived the heavenly tribulation. He harvested the lotus. He could cure Corvvis. Tears streamed down Cale's face as he stood, clutching the lotus to his chest. He turned, looking down at the valley below, at the fortress in the distance. Corvvis was there, waiting for him. He began to run down the mountain, faster than he'd ever run before, his heart racing with excitement, with love, with fear. What would Corvvis think when he saw him? Would he recognize him? Would he still love him, now that he was human? When he reached the fortress gates, the guards stared at him, at the strange, burned man in tattered clothes, clutching a glowing flower. They reached for their weapons, but Cale snarled, a sound that was still half fox, half human, and they stepped back, fear in their eyes. He didn't stop to explain. He ran through the gates, through the halls, toward Corvus's study. He could feel his presence, his powerful aura, his steady heartbeat. He was close. So close. He burst through the study door. Corvvis was sitting at his desk, the sect elder long gone. He looked up at the sound of the door, his head tilting, his scarred eyes facing Cale's direction. He could sense him, could feel his aura, familiar yet different. "Who are you?" Corvvis asked, his voice cold, defensive. "What are you doing in my fortress?" Cale's heart sank. He didn't recognize him. Not as a human. He took a step forward, holding out the veiled sun lotus. "Corvvis," he said, his voice hoarse, trembling. "It's me." "Cale." Corvvis froze. His body went rigid, his hands tightening into fists. "Cale," he whispered. "No. Cale is my fox. My companion." "I was your fox," Cale said. "But I'm human. This is who I really am. I summoned a heavenly tribulation, forced a transformation. To get this." He held up the lotus, its glow illuminating his face. "To cure you. To give you back your sight." Corvus stood, his movements slow, hesitant. He took a step forward, his hands outstretched, as if trying to touch Cale, to confirm he was real. "Prove it," he whispered. "Prove you're my Cale." Cale's throat tightened. He told him the things only they knew. The way he hated eating off the floor, the way he loved honey on his bread, the way he'd bitten Corvus's wrist to stop him from drinking the poison tea. He told him about the garden, about the kiss, about the way Corvus had held him when he was injured. Corvus's breath hitched. He took another step, his hands brushing against Cale's cheek. His fingers were warm, gentle, trembling. "It is you," he whispered. "My little fox. My Cale." Tears streamed down Corvus's face. He pulled Cale into his arms, holding him tightly, as if afraid he'd vanish. Cale dropped the lotus, wrapping his arms around Corvus's waist, burying his face in his chest. He could feel Corvus's tears soaking into his shirt, could hear his ragged breathing, could feel the beat of his heart against his own. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you," Cale whispered. "I was afraid. Afraid I wouldn't survive. Afraid I'd leave you alone." Corvus pulled back, his hands cupping Cale's face. His scarred eyes were inches from Cale's, and Cale could see the love in them. Even without sight, even with the ugly scar, the love was there, bright and fierce. "You're here," he said. "That's all that matters. You're here." He leaned down, pressing his lips to Cale's. It was nothing like their first kiss, soft, tentative, fur against lips. This was a human kiss, deep and passionate, full of love and longing and relief. Cale kissed him back, his hands tangling in Corvus's hair, his body pressing against his. He could taste the salt of his tears, feel the warmth of his skin, hear the soft moans that escaped his lips. When they pulled apart, Corvus rested his forehead against Cale's. "I love you," he whispered. "As a fox. As a human. As anything. I love you. I love you too," Cale said, his voice breaking. "More than anything." Corvus smiled, a soft, beautiful smile that transformed his face. He picked up the veiled sun lotus from the floor, his fingers brushing against its petals. "Will this really cure me?" he asked. Cale nodded. "It's the only thing that can. It will cleanse the poison from your eyes, give you back your sight." Corvus closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He brought the lotus to his lips, biting into it. The petals were sweet, juicy, and Cale could feel the healing energy surge from the lotus into Corvus's body, spreading through his veins, targeting the poison in his eyes. Corvus's body tensed. He let out a soft gasp, his hands clutching Cale's arms. "It's working," he whispered. "I can feel it. The poison is fading." Cale held him tightly, watching as the dark veins around Corvus's scar began to recede, as the discoloration faded, as the scar itself softened. He waited, his heart racing, as Corvus's eyes began to change, from empty sockets to something more. Something alive. Slowly, Corvus opened his eyes. They were beautiful. A deep, rich amber, like liquid honey, flecked with gold. They were sharp, intelligent, full of light, nothing like the empty sockets Cale had grown used to. They were Corvus's eyes, the eyes he'd lost so long ago, the eyes he'd dreamed of seeing again. Corvus stared at Cale, his amber eyes wide, his breath catching in his throat. "You're beautiful," he whispered. Cale laughed, a wet, relieved sound. "Says the man with amber eyes," he said. "You're not so bad yourself." Corvus smiled, a bright, genuine smile that made Cale's heart flutter. He reached up, his fingers brushing against Cale's cheek, as if memorizing his features. "I can see you," he said. "Really see you. Your silver hair, your sharp cheekbones, your eyes, they're like storm clouds, full of fire." Cale leaned into his touch, closing his eyes. "I told you I'd give you your sight back," he said. "You did," Corvus said. He pulled Cale into his arms again, holding him tightly, his face buried in his neck. "You risked your life for me. Sacrificed everything." "I'd do it again," Cale said. "In a heartbeat. For you." Corvus pulled back, his amber eyes locked on Cale's. "I'm never letting you go," he said. His voice was low, possessive, full of love. "You're mine. Forever." Cale smiled, leaning up to kiss him again. "Forever," he agreed. The months that followed were a blur of happiness and healing. Corvus adjusted to his sight, relearning to navigate the world with his eyes instead of his spiritual sense. He spent hours staring at Cale, at his face, his hands, his smile, as if afraid he'd vanish if he looked away. Cale reclaimed his identity as a photographer, setting up a studio in the fortress, capturing the beauty of the mountains, the fortress, and most of all Corvus. He took hundreds of photos of him. Corvus meditating, Corvus reading, Corvus smiling, Corvus looking at him with that soft, loving gaze. The sects that had once plotted against Corvus learned to fear him even more. Now that he had his sight back, now that he had a companion who was willing to risk everything for him, now that he was stronger, happier, more dangerous than ever. No one dared to challenge him. No one dared to poison him. No one dared to come between him and Cale. Their love deepened, grew stronger, more intense. The Imelacha of their early days faded into a deep, abiding intimacy, soft touches, gentle kisses, quiet whispers in the dark. They were inseparable, bound by love, by sacrifice, by a bond that transcended species and time. One evening, they were in the garden again, sitting on the stone bench where they'd shared their first kiss. The moon was full, casting silver light over the black roses and glowing mushrooms. Corvus had his arm around Cale, holding him close, his head resting on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd be happy again," Corvus said, his voice soft. "After I lost my sight, after everyone betrayed me, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone. A monster in a fortress." Cale turned, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "You're not a monster," he said. "You're just a man who's been hurt. A man who deserves to be loved." Corvus smiled, his amber eyes locking on Cale's. "And I found love," he said, "in the most unexpected way. In a mangy fox who snarled at me, who demanded silk beds and silver bowls, who risked his life to save mine." Cale laughed, nuzzling his neck. "I was a pretty good fox," he said. "The best," Corvus agreed. He leaned down, kissing him gently. "But I like you better as a human. So I can kiss you properly. So I can hold you. So I can tell you how much I love you, and you can say it back with words." "I love you," Cale said, his voice soft. "More than my camera. More than my studio. More than anything in this world or the last." Corvus smiled, pulling him closer. "I love you too," he said. "Forever and always." They sat there in the garden, watching the moon rise, holding each other close, their hearts beating as one. Cale thought about his previous life, his vanity, his selfishness, his obsession with beauty. Thought about how far he'd come, how much he'd changed. Thought about the man he'd been and the man he was now. He'd died over a lens cap, been reborn as an ugly fox, and fallen in love with a blind demon lord. It was a story he never would have believed if someone had told him, a story that was equal parts ridiculous and beautiful. But it was his story, his life, his love, and he wouldn't change a thing. Years later, when they were old and gray, when the fortress was quieter and the sex were no longer a threat, Cale would sit in his studio, looking at the photos he'd taken of Corvvis, young, strong, his amber eyes bright with love. He'd run his fingers over the images, smiling, remembering the day he'd sacrificed everything to give Corvvis his sight back. Corvvis would come into the studio, wrapping his arms around Cale from behind, resting his chin on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he'd ask, his voice soft with age. Cale would say, "About how I died over a lens cap and ended up with the love of my life." Corvvis would laugh, pressing a kiss to his neck. "Best lens cap accident ever," he'd say. And Cale would agree, because it was true. The worst day of his life had led him to the best thing that had ever happened to him. To Corvvis. To love. To forever. In the end, it wasn't about beauty or wealth or power. It was about love, about sacrifice, about being seen, truly seen, for who you are, not what you look like. It was about two broken souls, finding each other in the darkness and becoming whole.